It's a pleasure seeing everyone here this morning for the second day of the YIVO in America conference. I'm Jonathan Brent, Executive Director of the YIVO Institute. And I wanted to say a couple of words before introducing our speaker today, Kalman Weiser. What I would like to do is pick up a little bit on what Cecile Kuznets spoke about last night concerning the goals of the YIVO Institute, to instill pride and a sense of identity in Jewish youth. Those are excellent words. One has a rough idea of what they mean. But what do they actually mean? How does collecting a sewing set from a Lower East Side sweatshop instill pride in Jewish youth? How does collecting the autobiography, 7-page autobiography of a 13-year-old girl born in Vilna instill pride and identity in Jewish youth? How does collecting a box of Zaporozhian cigarettes instill pride? What are we talking about? When I was a kid and my father wanted to instill pride in us about being Jewish, he would point to Einstein and Freud, and he'd list all of the Nobel Prizes that we won. I some years ago, bought a book called The Jewish Contribution to Civilization that was published in England just before World War II. It was a desperate effort by a bookseller in England to show the world that the Jews actually were worth saving, that the Jews actually were a substantial people, and he even included Christopher Columbus in that list of great Jewish figures. That instills pride, or not. Knowing that it was a Jew who wrote the first European novel, that instills pride. That makes you proud of your people. Knowing that it was a Jew who built the atom bomb for Stalin, that's possibly something that'll give you a lift. But collecting a sewing kit on the Lower East Side, collecting a document, a scribbled agreement between the Water Carriers Union and the Ramailis Yeshiva in Vilnius in the 19th century, how does that instill pride or identity? And that's a question. It's a question of what you value. It's a question of what the core of the YIVO Institute really is all about. Because at the core of the YIVO Institute is the idea that ordinary life is worth valuing. Not the Taj Mahals, not the Tower of London, not the Michelangelos, not all of the prestigious Nobel Prizes, but the daily life of the people, the way they cared for their children, the way they educated them, the way, as my father often said in this story that he would tell, the way the rabbi puts his boots on in the morning. That's what YIVO is all about. And that is something that is very difficult to communicate to a lot of people, the value of ordinary life. And in this, YIVO was it was ahead of its time in terms of its understanding of that value and the intent to impress that upon the consciousness of the Jewish world. Well, we will say more about that, I hope, in the hours to come. In the meantime, it is a great pleasure to introduce Kalman Weiser, who I hope will give us a bit more insight into how YIVO has maneuvered in this ocean of objects and facts and items that it has collected over the years in the United States. So, Kalman?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today. Before I begin, I'd just like to thank a few people. I'm going to show you a lot of slides. And the better slides are ones that were provided by people here in YIVO, by Eddie Portnoy, by Alex Weiser, and Stephanie Halperin. The less good slides are the ones I found myself. I'd also like to thank Cecile Kuznets for many things, but right now I'd like to thank her for the wonderful talk she gave about YIVO mainly in its European period and the beginning of its American period. She spoke in a meticulous standard Yiddish, the language of the Yiddish cultural elite. As you hear already, I'm going to speak to you in a Canadian-tinged Staten Island English. The language of, well, I'll let you decide what that is the language of, but it's my language. I also want to draw your attention to this photo. You're going to see it again later, this building, Yiddish Scientific Institute. You know today's YIVO's name is not the Yiddish Scientific Institute. One of the things I will answer for you today, if I answer one thing, it's this. It is, why is YIVO no longer called the Yiddish Scientific Institute in English? Okay, so without further ado, I'll begin. In March 1940, let's see, I'm not advancing. What's going on? Oh, the green button. Yes, no one told me that. There we go. Okay. So this photo you've seen, Zosha Tchaikovsky. Okay. Max Weinreich, great. Okay, in March 1940, YIVO co-founder Max Weinreich arrived in New York Harbor, together with his elder son, Uriel. By a stroke of luck, the two were in Copenhagen when World War II erupted in September 1939 and unable to return home to Poland. They were received with open arms by YIVO's American division, der Amerikaner Opteil, which arranged for Weinreich's visa and employment. Okay, what you see right here, and I'll tell you about a little bit about the American division, the Amoptel. This is some of the founders in 1929. Max Weinreich is there in the front row on the right. Jacob Schatzky is there on the furthermost right. You'll hear about him. Max Weinreich next to him. And Samuel Charney, better known as Shmuel Nigel, the literary critic and historian in the middle. On the left is the Hayes building, which is now Joseph Papp's Public Theater on Lafayette Street, which is the original home of the American YIVO. So they were received with open arms by YIVO's American division, which arranged for Weinreich's visa and employment. Its 3 rented rooms in the Hayes building, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society on Lafayette Street, now the site of Joseph Papp's Public Theater, paled in size with YIVO's building in Vilna, but it raised a substantial part of the Vilna Institute's annual budget. Weinreich joined a critical mass of YIVO scholars already active in New York. These included such American division members as historian Jacob Schatzky, literary historian and critic Samuel Charney, and linguists Yudel Malk and Yuda Yoffe. In fact, the heads of all of YIVO's academic sections were soon present in New York. Leibush Lele of YIVO's pedagogical psychological section and Yankiv Lashinsky, who directed its economic statistical section, had been present in America since before the war. Elias or Elia Cherikover, the head of YIVO's historical section, arrived a few months later from Paris with his wife, Riva. Their numbers were soon reinforced with the arrival of additional refugees, intellectuals fleeing Hitler's Europe. The secretary of YIVO's philological section and the Institute's guiding spirit, Max Weinreich was now appointed to the newly created position of YIVO's research director. He immediately set to work devoting himself with characteristic energy to expanding the activities of the American division beyond fundraising, collecting material about American Yiddish culture to send to Vilna, and publishing its own scholarly yearbook. At the same time, he carefully monitored political and military events in Europe as best as he could, and attempted to coordinate activities as long as possible with colleagues in Vilna and with YIVO branches worldwide. As the war dragged on and contact with Vilna was interrupted, Weinreich publicly proclaimed YIVO's commitment to a Jewish future in Europe. At the same time, he affirmed the decision to make New York the world center, at least for the duration of the war and possibly indefinitely, of a global organization dedicated to the study of contemporary Jewish life. The American division merged with the Central Jewish Library and Press Archives, an independent organization which shared its premises in the Hayas building to form what became known as Der YIVO in America, the YIVO in America. The newly minted YIVO in America inherited the Central Library's 15,000 chiefly Yiddish volumes and artifacts as a basis for its collections, as well as its self-trained librarian, Mendel Elkin, a former dentist and lifelong Yiddish literature and theater enthusiast. So what I'm showing you here, I skipped a little bit, is these are the other heads of the Vilna and YIVO, the chief administrators, Zela Kalmanovich, who you can see on the left in the center, in the first row, and Zalman Reisen is on the right, the first on the left. Unfortunately, they did not survive the war. One was killed in a German camp in Estonia, a work camp, and the other was taken prisoner and killed by the Soviets. But this was not known until later, of course. I think this is not the updated version of the talk. Okay, that's okay. There are some slides missing, but so be it. Okay. You'll meet Mendel Elkin later again. Okay, the 1940s and early 50s were a time of staggering productivity by YIVO associates in New York City, motivated by an urgent sense of purpose in desperate times. Anxiety over the uncertain future of the Institute during the war years and their immediate aftermath was naturally exacerbated by growing awareness of the gruesome fate of friends, family, and colleagues in Eastern Europe. Further, while those YIVO associates who had made it to New York were mercilessly spared genocide, they were tormented by debilitating feelings of rage, despair, depression, and impotence as the dimensions of what we today know as the Holocaust became clear and penetrated their consciousness. For members of the founding generation of YIVO scholars who survived the destruction of Eastern European Jewry, Vilna and all that it represented as a center of secular Jewish culture would occupy a hallowed place in memory and nostalgia as the embodiment of the youthful aspirations of the Institute and its staff. It never ceased to be the yardstick by which to measure achievements in an America to whose stony shores it was not clear YIVO's mission could be successfully transplanted. The dynamic encounter with a massive American Jewish community, increasingly dominant in English and little attuned to the Yiddishist ideals upon which YIVO was founded, obliged staff to reconsider profoundly the Institute's ideology, goals, and methods of by the late 1940s. Many colleagues and observers then questioned not only Max Weinreich's vision to broaden YIVO's mandate, to make it a leading center for the study of American as well as Eastern European Jewry, they questioned the very wisdom of pursuing a future for the Institute beyond circles of transplanted Eastern European Jews, wherever they were to be found. In the early post-World War II era, YIVO clung to its mission of producing knowledge, as Yudel Malk put it, from the folk, for the folk, and with the folk. But how could this mission be pursued when the largest part of that folk, the Yiddish-speaking masses of Eastern Europe, was no longer alive or scattered to new continents? And where would YIVO draw its material and moral support in the absence of the unique ecosystem of Yiddish schools, labor and political organizations, press and journals, and cultural societies with which it enjoyed a symbiotic relationship in Poland and neighboring countries. Particularly in the United States, YIVO scholars and activists were pessimistic about the survival of secular Yiddish culture and interest in Eastern European Jewry beyond their own generation, despite the existence of a still vibrant and variegated Yiddish cultural scene. Max Weinreich, however, was certain that American Jewry needed YIVO and its tradition of philological, historical, and social science research just as much, if not more, than YIVO needed American Jewry, if American Jewry were to exercise not only demographic, financial, and political preeminence in the post-World War II era, but also intellectual and cultural leadership of world Jewry. Both symbolically and practically, Weinreich's arrival in America in 1940 marks the beginning of a still unfolding American era in YIVO's history. His vision and imposing personality provided much of YIVO's direction and impetus for decades to come. Yet today, in 2025, some 85 years since New York became YIVO's world center, we still know relatively little about YIVO's history in America in comparison with its storied first 15 years in Vilna. Now, in my remarks today, I would like to shed light on the challenges faced by YIVO at the beginning of its American era by discussing Weinreich's vision for an American YIVO and the struggle over its direction that culminated in his own estrangement from the very institute whose first offices were held in a desk in his Vilna apartment. Of middling height, bespectacled and graying, 46-year-old Max Weinreich was hardly a physically imposing figure. But Dr. Weinreich, as he was called by almost everyone, commanded universal respect in the Yiddish world and beyond for his towering intelligence and polymath scholarship in linguistics, literature, cultural history, and social psychology. His name was virtually synonymous with the Institute, even if he shared its administrative leadership in Vilna with Zalman Reisen and Zelig Kalmanovich, scholars I mentioned who did not survive the war. At a press conference at Greenberg's restaurant on the Lower East Side, by the way, I've looked for it, I can't find Greenberg's restaurant. It's probably a nightclub now. In October of 1940, Weinreich explained to the city's Yiddish intelligentsia that relocating YIVO's nerve center to New York did not simply entail the mechanical transfer of operations and structures from Vilna in order to relocate an Eastern European Jewish institution to America. On the contrary, in this and other addresses in the 1940s, Weinreich charted a course to intensify YIVO's research activities in New York, to enlarge library and archival holdings inherited from the American division, to increase its number of publications, and to expand its audience and financial base beyond chiefly working-class immigrants and relief organizations such as the Joint Distribution Committee. Perhaps most significantly, Weinreich called for what amounted to a radical reorientation in YIVO's attitude toward America and the English language. He spoke of the importance of devoting serious attention not only to the relatively neglected subject of Yiddish culture in the United States, but to understanding American Jewry and the economic, social, and psychological problems it faced. To achieve these goals, it was essential to draw more scholars into YIVO's orbit, including English-speaking academics, and to begin training a new generation of American-born students in Yiddish linguistics, literature, and folklore, and the broader YIVO tradition of interdisciplinary scholarship in history and the social sciences. Speaking to a packed auditorium at Hunter College at YIVO's first conference as the organization's world headquarters in January 1941, Weinreich asked rhetorically whether coming together to discuss scholarship was justified as a Chorben. A destruction of yet unknown proportions threatened the whole of Eastern European Jewry, as well as Western European and Central European Jewry. His answer was characteristic of his perspective on the role of YIVO in Jewish life. It depends on whether you see research as entertainment for good times or a necessary part of a collective's existence. Research about Jewish life and Jewish problems was for Weinreich, as Cecile explained last night, not a luxury, but a necessity. YIVO had been called into existence, he reminded his audience, for the benefit of the Yiddish-speaking masses. The Institute, with its commitment to gathering and analyzing information about Jewish life, was the intellectual gathering point, he boasted, for the more than 3 million strong Jewish community of interwar Poland. In an environment where conditions were so difficult for Jews as they were in Poland, YIVO contributed to the building of Jewish resilience through self-knowledge. Applying a martial metaphor to describe a people with neither a state nor an army, Weinreich remarked that, quote, YIVO was not a toy that a bunch of bookworms play with for their own pleasure, but a great Jewish folk institution to help the collective and the individual with the weapons of scientific research, end quote. Yet to understand its significance for Jewish life in Poland, he continued, one could not simply measure the achievements of a few dozen scholars in Vilna working together for uncertain wages to document and study Jewish life. Rather, one needed to appreciate YIVO as a source of pride for Yiddish speakers and the quasi-religious significance it possessed as a bastion of modern, secular Jewish learning for a largely impoverished Eastern European Jewry still rooted in tradition prior to World War II. He maintained that, quote, a deep faith in YIVO as a new center of Jewish spirituality emanated from all its documents, and Yiddishkeit is, after all, spirituality, end quote. Could America emerge as a new center of Jewish intellectual life? Weinreich asked rhetorically at the YIVO conference. A student of Simon Dubnov, the intellectual father of the Jewish cultural political theory known as autonomism, Weinreich understood Jews as having possessed multiple demographic and cultural centers across the millenniums. Over the centuries, he explained, Jews had migrated from Western Asia to Western and then Eastern Europe, most recently establishing new centers for their national culture along the way in such places as Frankfurt am Main and Vilna. America, with its more than 4 million Jews, possessed a larger Jewish population than Poland and the 3 Baltic states combined, and was significantly more prosperous and physically secure. But it was still young and still culturally and intellectually reliant to a large extent on the leadership of Eastern European Jewry. Did it possess the necessary vitality and resilience to become the next center of Jewish civilization? Several of Weinreich's YIVO colleagues doubted this, whether openly or in private. They saw American Jewry as benevolent but immature, willing to provide philanthropic support for its suffering brethren in Eastern Europe, but not for building Jewish culture, above all scholarship. Further, American Jews were by and large ashamed of Yiddish, which they associated with old world poverty and ignorance. It was a burden best left behind in order to become full-fledged Americans. Weinreich himself lamented the quality of Yiddish spoken in America and the state of Jewish scholarship here. Scholarship was still largely committed to the study of Semitic philology in universities or investigations of colonial era and 19th century Jewish contributions to American society and its economy by amateur scholars seeking to demonstrate Jews' worthiness for inclusion in the American nation. Even high-quality scholarship by professional sociologists that did not ignore the massive wave of Eastern European Jewish immigration since the 1880s was, as far as Weinreich was concerned, of limited value. It tended to view the dissolution of a distinctive Jewish cultural identity as a progressive and unavoidable phenomenon. In Weinreich's appraisal, American Jews were at best willing to give money for the study of contemporary anti-Semitism, the primary issue that pained them as Jews, by advocacy organizations and for the production of apologetics to combat it, but not for the study of all facets of Jewish life and its strengthening, which was, of course, YIVO's raison d'etre. This was reflected in the pitiful lack of support offered YIVO by mainstream American Jewish organizations, above all by the Council of Jewish Federations and welfare funds. YIVO relied instead on the individual contributions of immigrant Jews and their social and cultural organizations such as the Workmen's Circle and labor unions, as well as some wealthy patrons. Indeed, into the 1950s, YIVO faced mounting debt as its operating costs routinely exceeded income. Most of YIVO's 24 or so associates worked full-time positions in addition to their work at YIVO in order to support themselves. Many of its most ambitious projects had to be scrapped or as in the case of its pioneering history of the Jewish labor movement in the United States, for example, or its Hasidic folklore drive in the 1940s, had to be put on hold for lack of funding and staff. For cultural nationalists such as Weinreich, American Jewry was part of a global Jewish people rooted in Eastern Europe, and for whom YIVO served as its national library and academy. Ideologically committed to Yiddish as the language of this people, YIVO had made very limited use of non-Jewish languages prior in its publications, despite growing linguistic assimilation in the interwar period in Eastern Europe. In America, in contrast, language shift was far more advanced among Jews, thanks in part to a longer tradition of attending public schools and the greater openness of American society. Weinreich and his colleagues viewed English perhaps more positively than Polish, thanks to its status as a world language, the high caliber of American universities, and the comparative lack of violent anti-Semitism in American society. But they still treated compromise with English as a necessary evil. English was an important tool for outreach to draw American Jewry, especially its youth, to Yiddish and to YIVO's brand of scholarship. Hence, Weinreich proposed that YIVO publish bilingual annotated editions of Yiddish literature. I think I have an image of this. Let me see. Here we go. On the right, you can see YIVO's first, this is, again, like so many things ahead of its time, this is probably the first bilingual edition Yiddish-English of Peretz, put out in the 1940s by YIVO. But Weinreich viewed the creation of a distinctly American Jewish culture in a language that is English, whose cultural resonances and imagery were historically Christian, as an inherently flawed enterprise. But precisely because he considered American Jewry young and not fully formed, Weinreich saw an opportunity for YIVO to shape and guide it, especially its youth. While American Jewish youth lacked Jewish knowledge and were often ashamed of their Jewishness, they showed great academic potential. They possessed more secular knowledge than Eastern European Jews, whose access to schooling was limited by poverty and discrimination. Introducing them to highbrow Yiddish culture and the YIVO scholarly tradition, he argued, would help to show them a way to live proudly and productively as Jews in the modern world, and rid them of what he considered internalized anti-Semitism. Weinreich expressed confidence that American Jewry, at least a vital core, would come to embrace Jewish cultural distinctiveness and be made ready to assume global Jewish intellectual leadership under YIVO's tutelage. Until now, he proclaimed in 1941, there was no Jewish institution in America whose task was to research the entirety of Jewish life, from the present and the past in America, and everywhere with the methods of modern social science. Now there is a Yiddish Scientific Institute. Today it is small, but it will one day become great. In the 1940s, YIVO produced an impressive array of publications on diverse topics in the areas of modern Jewish history, demographics, sociology, linguistics, literature, and psychology, as well as works concerning more general topics such as language and race relations in the United States. If you download YIVO Blätter from the 1940s and 50s, it's remarkable what was achieved. The Institute's public lectures, adult education courses, and other events that we've largely forgotten about today drew enthusiastic participation and acquainted a broad audience with the latest in scholarship about contemporary Jewry. It hosted exhibitions about aspects of American and Eastern European Jewish life, including the recent genocide and the fate of survivors, for whom it collected testimonies immediately after the war. Indeed, long before scholarship about the Holocaust was widespread, YIVO scholars were pioneers in documenting and studying it. Weinreich himself authored Hitler's Professors, which you see here in the middle, the first study of German academics' role in legitimating the extermination of the Jews. By the way, Weinreich wrote this book in English, which was probably his 8th language, and only later translated this into Yiddish because he wanted this to be available for the Nuremberg trials. 4-day annual conferences, usually held in January at Hunter College, were more than professional meetings of academic specialists or gatherings of Yiddish-speaking intellectuals. They were communal events that routinely drew crowds well in excess of 1,000 people, and sometimes as many as 2,000 people, to hear prominent lecturers reflecting on topical matters such as the recent Nuremberg trials at their opening night in Hunter College's auditorium. The opening night's orations, as well as more specialized academic talks given over the following days, and reports about the progress of the Institute were discussed for days in the global Jewish press in Yiddish, Hebrew, English, and in other languages. YIVO also managed to transport the archives of its historical section from France to New York City, and with the help of the American government, to reclaim a large part of its Vilna collection of books and archival materials that had miraculously survived the Germans and the Soviets. Its expanded archival and library holdings, enhanced through systematic collection and the increased donations of materials, necessitated its relocation to a regal new home. Now let's see if I have a photo here. Yes, so this is the regal new home. The building was bought in 1942. The inauguration was 1943. YIVO moved from its cramped and dusty premises in Lower Manhattan to a mansion on 123rd Street and Broadway that had formerly housed the Jewish Theological Seminary. Its small staff of full and part-time workers grew significantly, in part through the post-war absorption of recently arrived Holocaust survivors employed with the help of US government grants for refugees. Among them, there we go, in the middle, okay. Among them was, for example, Dina Abramovich, whom many of you knew well, a young partisan who had worked as a librarian in the Vilna ghetto and who would later succeed Mendel Elkin, whom you see on the left. That's Hirschbein on the right and Elkin on the left. She would later succeed Mendel Elkin as YIVO's head librarian. With YIVO's support, she received training in library science at Columbia University, adding to the professionalization of a largely autodidact staff. To reach an audience as large as possible, YIVO departed from its pre-war practice of irregularly publishing an almost exclusively Yiddish language bulletin to publish a monthly bilingual English-Yiddish one. So step back. So this is, of course, YIVO Yedias. On the left is the very first issue from 1943 in America. The final page announces the death of Elias Cherikover. The second page is the second issue, the front page in English. It was essentially Yiddish-English, roughly half and half, but the Yiddish issues were always more detailed than the English ones into the 1950s. It also introduced YIVO Annual, which presented a selection of works from its flagship journal, YIVO Blätter, in English translation. Its attempts to continue the Aspirantur, its pre-war graduate training division, were less successful. They were stymied by the demands of military service on American Jewish youth and the lack of attractive career options for its students at a time when Jewish studies had not yet found purchase in American universities, and YIVO itself was in no position to hire its students full-time. But it nonetheless managed to offer courses to a number of future scholars, including such important figures as, I'll show you a photo, including such important figures in the subsequent history of YIVO and American Jewish scholarship as linguists Uriel Weinreich and Joshua Fishman, and folklorist Beatrice Silverman Weinreich, that's Bina Weinreich, and Chana Mlotek. All of them exceptional graduates of Yiddish secular schools as well as American universities. It also helped to introduce Yiddish studies to American universities, sponsoring courses in Yiddish linguistics and folklore for students at UCLA in the summer of 1948, and publishing College Yiddish, the first modern scientific textbook for use in English language universities in 1949. Weinreich himself became professor of Yiddish at City College in New York in 1947, helping to spread YIVO language norms such as spelling to American-born students. For all of its impressive achievements, YIVO in New York drew not only praise in the Jewish press and the growing recognition of American academics, it also attracted withering critiques. in Yiddish cultural circles that questioned whether it was fulfilling its historic mandate. The extent of these critiques, which span the political spectrum, testify, however, to the degree to which YIVO was considered an indispensable public institution responsible to the Yiddish Gesellschaftlichkeit, that is, Yiddish-speaking organizations and their constituencies primarily outside the Orthodox world, where secular Yiddishism found little sympathy. Occasional complaints recalled pre-war ones that YIVO neglected Hebrew, Yiddish's pre-war rival for the title of Jewish national language, and a language associated both with religious tradition and the Zionist movement. YIVO's staff, composed largely of socialist Bundists, labor Zionists, and Yiddish territorialists, was also accused, on the one hand, of striving to remain nonpartisan as much as possible, and on the other hand, of discriminating against communist and pro-Soviet elements, as well as their schools and publications in America. Most of the dissatisfaction, however, centered on YIVO's relationship to Eastern Europe and to Yiddish in the wake of the Holocaust. Some critics objected that YIVO had lost its way by devoting too much attention to the United States and made too many compromises with English, when its primary duty ought to be documenting and preserving the legacy of a murdered Eastern European Jewry. Future Nobel Prize-winning author Isaac Bashevis Singer, let me find his photo. There he is on the left. He, for example, complained that YIVO was not doing enough to record the treasures of the Yiddish language and its customs, while competent Eastern European-born speakers and scholars were still to be found. YIVO linguist Yutal Malk, you see him on the right, similarly demanded that YIVO focus its efforts on documenting the Holocaust and the civilization it destroyed. A veteran educator in Yiddish secular schools on both sides of the Atlantic, he possessed little faith in the ability of those scholars present in America, of those schools present in America, to produce the next generation of consumers and producers of Yiddish culture and scholarship, when Yiddish was decreasingly the language spoken at home by Jewish schoolchildren. Other voices, to the contrary, protested that YIVO dwelt too much on the past and ought to make ever greater accommodations to an English-speaking Jewry, both in order to remain relevant and to raise funds desperately needed for its survival among donors for whom Yiddish was a relic of the immigrant experience. And yet other voices complained that YIVO had turned its back on the immigrant Lower East Side, the working-class Jews and their organizations who were its mainstay. They variously reproached YIVO with moving to aristocratic Morningside Heights, where scarcely a Yiddish word was heard, with publishing snobbish YIVO Yiddish, full of highfalutin Hebraisms and unintelligible neologisms, and with futilely seeking to attract an uninterested American Jewish youth. In summary, critiques centered around the question of who was the folk YIVO strived to serve in the present and in the future. Eastern European Jews, wherever they were to be found in concentrated masses, an English-speaking American Jewry that had achieved or was aspiring to bourgeois respectability, or only those aging, largely working-class groups within American Jewry that explicitly supported Yiddish culture. YIVO's founding generation was itself getting on its years, with not a few deaths already registered in America, beginning with Elias Shelikova in 1943. Less prominently, debates about YIVO's direction also touched upon the degree to which YIVO should devote itself to high-caliber research or work of a more popular nature, such as exhibits and adult education programs, to meet the cultural needs of a non-expert audience. In late 1951, YIVO's board of directors announced the results of a self-study commission to determine whether reorganization and a change in its focus was necessary. Affirming the centrality of Yiddish to its mission, it explained that YIVO would continue to focus on Eastern European Jewry, but it would emphasize Eastern European Jewry's contributions to life in newer Jewish centers worldwide, rather than limit itself to the past or only to America. Indeed, YIVO in New York aspired to closer relations with YIVO branches, committees, and Friends of YIVO societies around the world. By 1952, such organizations existed not only in larger cities in the United States, such as Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, and Canada, and Winnipeg, and Montreal, and Toronto, but also in Latin America, Australia, South Africa, Western Europe, and Israel. These smaller local bodies, some of which predated World War II, organized fundraising events, solicited materials for YIVO's archives in New York, purchased and sent books for the library, and held public events such as exhibits and lectures, often held by touring YIVO representatives coming from New York. The exception to this New York-centric model was YIVO's branch in Buenos Aires, which maintained contact with New York, but remained independent after World War II. The Argentine YIVO established its own archives and collections, as well as produced its own publications to serve Latin America's largest Jewish community to this day. YIVO in New York continued to collect and accept materials about Jewish life everywhere, as reflected in the acquisition of Holocaust documentation from across Europe, including about non-Ashkenazic Jews and about the Ladino language. Indeed, even if preserving the cultural legacy of non-Ashkenazic Jews was never expressed as an explicit or primary goal, photos and announcements on the pages of its bulletin, Yedias, throughout the post-World War II era, particularly in the 1950s, reflect an interest in non-Ashkenazic Jewish communities in North Africa, Ethiopia, the Balkans, and elsewhere. These communities had come into closer contact with Ashkenazic Jewry as a result of the recent war and immigration, particularly to Israel. Moreover, YIVO journals never limited themselves to writing about Ashkenazic or Yiddish-speaking Jews, not before World War II and not after World War II. If anything, the Holocaust and the birth of Israel affirmed for YIVO's staff, as for many Jews everywhere, a sense of interconnectedness and a common fate. It would be a mistake, however, to conclude that post-war realities and intensified interest in non-Ashkenazic Jewish languages and cultures reflected a deviation from YIVO's diaspora-focused, Ashkenazic-centric worldview. Yiddish at this time remained the most widely spoken language among Jews, and their largest concentration, who were overwhelmingly Ashkenazic, was to be found in the United States. YIVO publicly envisioned a future for Yiddish as a language that united Jews worldwide, but it also worried about the language's future, especially in America and Israel. It was therefore imperative for YIVO to affirm in 1948 its support for Israel as an emerging Jewish center, while expressing its hope that Yiddish, along with other forms of diasporic Jewish culture, had a future there also. While the emerging Cold War foreclosed opportunities for collaboration with scholars in Eastern Europe by the 1950s, YIVO cooperated closely in coming years with the newly created chair for Yiddish at the Hebrew University to promote Yiddish scholarship. It also worked with Yad Vashem, the newly founded Israeli Holocaust Authority, for over a decade to share documentation and produce resources for the study of the Holocaust and the commemoration of destroyed Jewish communities. Given YIVO's financial straits, this essential work would not have been possible without German reparations, which was then, of course, a very controversial subject that bitterly divided the Yiddish and broader Jewish worlds. Dramatically, YIVO co-founder Yitzhak Isaac Nachman Steinberg resigned from its board in protest. But what he and others denounced as blood money helped to fund many important YIVO projects and employ Holocaust survivors as workers for more than a decade into the 1960s. As impressive as YIVO's accomplishments were in the 1940s and 50s in retrospect, particularly in light of the circumstances, Max Weinreich was profoundly disappointed. In his estimation, YIVO had become chiefly a library and an archive. While collecting books and documentation was always one of YIVO's pillars of activity, he complained that the Institute was underperforming in the areas of research and publications. Most importantly, it was not systematically training a new generation of scholars to carry on its mission. In his view, YIVO's neglect of these functions could no longer be justified by the exigencies of the war years and their immediate aftermath. Weinreich also worried deeply about proposals to change YIVO's English name as a means to draw a broader audience and raise more money for its operations. Yiddish Scientific Institute, colleagues such as Samuel Charney argued, was a poor translation from Jiddischer Wissenschaftliche Institut, since Yiddish also meant Jewish in English and science usually meant the natural and not social sciences. As Weinreich and others opposed to this change pointed out, however, YIVO was called into being foremost for the purpose of conducting research about Yiddish-speaking Jewry in Yiddish. The choice of Yiddish Scientific Institute in 1925 as the English-speaking name was a deliberate one. A YIVO without Yiddish was no longer YIVO. Changing its name represented to Weinreich's mind a capitulation to the prejudice that all things Yiddish were inherently inferior. Further, he argued it would likely do nothing to expand YIVO's audience, since it was YIVO's fundamental program, its emphasis on Jewish distinctiveness and the European roots of American Jewry, that was the main obstacle to finding a welcome place among the masses of contemporary American Jews. Weinreich warned of a slippery slope. Yiddish in YIVO's name would be the first victim. It would be followed by the removal of Yiddish signage, such as Stuppen and Ziehen, from the doors. Eventually, he warned the very acronym YIVO, an acronym he had personally coined, would disappear from the Institute's name since it betrayed YIVO's origins in Yiddish. Beginning in the summer of 1950, Weinreich took a leave of absence from YIVO to devote himself to work on what would become his magnum opus, Geschichte von der Jiddische Sprache, History of the Yiddish Language. So satisfied was he with his time away from the Institute and the renewed pleasure of long days devoted to research rather than administration and proofreading publications painstakingly, that he extended the leave for another year from 1951 to 52. During his absence from formal duties, opposition to his return as research director hardened among his opponents in YIVO. Following further discussions by the Self-Study Committee, YIVO's administration voted in 1952 for the Institute's reorganization. Weinreich, who had resolutely objected to changing YIVO's name and pushed for the creation of a graduate school, was outvoted by the majority seeking to take the Institute in a different direction. Feeling outmaneuvered, he resigned from his position as research director. The position was replaced with a 9-member committee on research that would choose projects and conduct research under the guidance of a coordinator serving limited hours. Opponents of the decision in the Yiddish press framed it as little more than a calculated purge. Under the guise of democratizing the Institute's leadership, a mutinous faction had ousted Weinreich, its father, from his rightful position as head of the Institute because he insisted on Yiddish as the language of the Institute's operations and privileged research and training over the expansion of archival collections and scholarly popularization. They complained bitterly that YIVO had strayed from the path of Vilna, embodied by Weinreich and the old guard of scholars active in Europe prior to the war, and instead embarked on the path of New York, represented by YIVO's executive secretary, Mark Uvalier. This new path involved proposals to attract non-elite and English-speaking audiences, such as publishing publishing a journal that was in English and publishing articles that were more accessible to a general audience. This, they warned, would lead YIVO away from research about Eastern Europe and cause it to diminish the role of Yiddish, which they feared would eventually disappear from YIVO. While there certainly existed tensions in the organization around its direction and factions gathered around Weinreich and Uvalier, the divisions were more of degree than kind. No one in YIVO seriously supported wholly abandoning its Eastern European legacy or Yiddish. Nonetheless, its members were divided, at times bitterly, about how much to engage America and the use of very limited resources. The conflict between Weinreich and Uvalier was more personal than ideological and practical. Weinreich sensed that Uvalier, a highly ambitious and talented administrator active in the pre-war Yiddish Actors Union in Warsaw, sought to unseat him as the Institute's leader. He was not only disinclined to cede control of the Institute, convinced as always of the rectitude of his own positions, as a scholar and acknowledged expert who had guided the Institute from its earliest days, Weinreich could also not abide a non-researcher dictating the path of the Institute he had co-founded and built. The feelings were mutual. Uvalier saw Weinreich as an impractical scholar with little appetite for American fundraising techniques and unsuited to direct an institute. Further, despite near universal admiration for Weinreich as a brilliant scholar and a talented researcher and talented teacher, many in the Institute, in fact, objected to what they considered his micromanaging of virtually all aspects of the Institute's functioning. His critics described him as intellectually arrogant and inflexible. Published volumes of the Great Dictionary of the Yiddish Language, for example, a project headed by Yudel Mark, did not receive YIVO's imprimatur, largely due to an emotionally laden divide over spelling. Now I'm coming to the end, so thank you for your patience. Following renewed debate between proponents and opponents of greater Americanization within the Committee on Research, YIVO did indeed change its name in 1955, briefly to the Jewish Scientific Institute, and then permanently to the current name, the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, a decision, of course, provoking outrage in the Yiddish press. To Weinreich's relief, the acronym YIVO was at least preserved. The Institute also moved into a new home, the former Vanderbilt Mansion on 5th Avenue and 86th Street. Unfortunately, I don't have a good picture with me here. That's in the updated version that didn't get here till too late, but I'm sure you'll see the building later. It was purchased with proceeds from the sale of the Morningside Heights address and contributions from YIVO's wealthiest supporters, after the city of New York decided to clear the area for the construction of a housing complex. A dispirited Weinreich, who previously had a hand in almost all YIVO matters, kept at a distance from YIVO's day-to-day administration for roughly the next decade. The Committee on Research, which met about once a month, exercised only loose control over research to the detriment of larger projects requiring much supervision and coordination, such as the YIVO Yad Vashem Holocaust Project. By the late 1950s, YIVO's research journals were appearing with decreasing frequency. The chief culprits were a lack of funding, declining readership, and the dwindling number of personnel capable of contributing to and editing its Yiddish language publications as the ranks thinned of scholars educated in pre-war Eastern Europe. Nonetheless, YIVO's staff remained very active, cataloging its ever-expanding collections and with myriad other endeavors. Neither Weinreich nor his influence permanently left YIVO, however. While Yuval Lear left for Israel to work in the 1950s, Weinreich continued to sit on YIVO's executive board and participated in its conferences and various projects for years to come. Ironically, his distance from YIVO for roughly a decade afforded him the time to complete his history of the Yiddish language, what he called spiritual weapons for those who come after me. His gloom about the future of Yiddish and Jewish scholarship was somewhat alleviated by the presence of a growing number of young scholars speaking at his conferences in the 1960s and active in research activities. Following his retirement from City College in 1964, he again became a presence in YIVO's building, so much so that YIVO's newly appointed executive director, the young Shmuel Lapin, complained that he could not make a decision without it first being reviewed and approved by Weinreich. In retrospect, it is difficult to imagine that YIVO could have fulfilled all the goals that Max Weinreich set for it. But Weinreich was a maximalist who believed that only by aspiring to the highest standards, whether it be, for example, the use of YIVO's spelling or thoroughness of research, could YIVO make modest accomplishments. Even in the moments of his greatest despair about the future of Yiddish and YIVO, he did not surrender the conviction that American Jewry, if only a small academic elite, could be shaped by YIVO to ensure that not only the Institute, but the Jewish people would have a future worthy of its distinguished past. While he never saw the publication of his 4-volume History of the Yiddish Language, Weinreich witnessed shortly before his death in 1969 the realization of 2 major projects reflecting his commitment to YIVO's future and the future of Yiddish studies. These were the creation of an intensive Yiddish language and culture summer institute in conjunction with Columbia University in 1968, and the birth of the YIVO Center for Advanced Jewish Studies, what was posthumously named the Max Weinreich Center in 1969. The center was chartered by New York State to provide 4-credit courses to graduate students pursuing Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish studies, as well as financial support and guidance to recent PhDs conducting research in those fields. The 2 programs educated and continue to educate thousands of students, helping to make possible not only the transmission of knowledge following the irreparable cultural rupture created by the Holocaust, but it also facilitated the integration of Eastern European Jewish studies into American academia. They fortuitously arrived at a moment when American academia was becoming more receptive to ethnic studies, and a part of American-born Jewish youth was eager to recover a lost heritage and to apply innovative and up-to-date scholarly approaches to its examination. Graduates of YIVO programs have long represented a who's who of the fields of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish studies, as well as the Jewish cultural arts. As one of the few great Yiddish scholars and YIVO co-founders to escape the Holocaust, Weinreich's near-miraculous survival helped to ensure the transmission of Yiddish scholarship, and YIVO as an institution following the destruction of more than a generation of scholars and the dispersion of the folk, from which YIVO derived its purpose and vitality. Of course, he was not alone in this task, but his personality and vision left its imprint on YIVO for decades to come. His goal of continuing YIVO's mission as a truly global institution rooted in the culture of Eastern Europe was impossible to wholly fulfill in post-World War II conditions. By the late 1960s, most YIVO societies outside of New York had already closed for lack of funding and interest among the children of immigrants. Nor did YIVO become the leading center for the social scientific study of contemporary American Jewry as he initially hoped. American Jewish organizations and universities instead came to fulfill this role. But without Weinreich's dogged pursuit of a program of research and training, as well as collecting, a grossly underfunded YIVO would likely have closed its doors not long after the demise of the Eastern European-born generation. And who knows what would have become of Yiddish studies. It would take the passing of Weinreich's generation, born in the late 19th century, to make space for a new generation that had come of age in post-World War II world to assume leadership of the Institute and complete its Americanization in the closing decades of the 20th century. This meant leading it on a course beginning in the 1970s, a greater engagement with a university-educated, middle-class, English-speaking American Jewry, from which its staff was increasingly drawn and whose needs and sensitivities it better understood than Weinreich's generation. The YIVO that emerged would serve as a guardian of the cultural treasures of the Eastern European past and their mediator and interpreter for the benefit of generations that did not know Eastern Europe personally or its languages. But that is a story for another day. Today, some 85 years since New York became YIVO's world center, YIVO continues to strive to meet the evolving needs of a community that is scarcely less divided along political and ideological lines than the Yiddish-speaking folk of the past. What continues to unite its community and to animate its mission is a devotion to the legacy of Eastern European Jewry and to discovering meaning in it for the present. Thank you. By the way, I neglected to say, because I got caught up in my own words, that this is the 1970 class. This is the third year on the left of the YIVO Institute Yiddish summer program named for Uriel Weinreich. That's Mordechai Schechter in the very middle, and probably many other faces you might recognize. And that is the original charter for the Max Weinreich Center on the right. Thank you again.
We'll take just a few minutes for questions now, and then we'll head into the next panel.
I see that you survived without subtitles. That's very good.
Thank you very, very much, Kalman. I had a question which would have started, you didn't mention two words, which were Israel and Palestine, but you came to them. But I was curious, really, whether there was what was the YIVO discussion about what was happening in the 1940s and 50s in Palestine, Israel? Was there any thought given to establishing a YIVO center there? All of that, really.
Well, I mean, first, it's important to keep in mind that YIVO already had representation in what was British Mandatory Palestine before World War II. YIVO also had relations with people working in the Hebrew University. What I didn't mention, because there's too much to mention, that there was a thought of actually bringing YIVO to Israel. Well, it wasn't Israel yet, but right around 1947, there was some thought that all those collections that were being, how should I say, rescued after World War II, they should go to what was going to become Israel, and that YIVO should go along with it. And Max Weinreich was offered the chair in Yiddish at the Hebrew University, and he spent about 6 months mulling this over in 1950, decided that it wasn't for him. I think what a lot of people may not understand about this time is that while many of the YIVO people weren't necessarily Zionists, some were, some weren't, they were generally sympathetic to the idea of Israel. After all, this was their brethren who had just survived the Holocaust. They were concerned that YIVO culture would be represented. There were individuals who had more concerns of a political nature about, for instance, what will be Arab-Jewish relations in this context and so on. But YIVO did not, it issued a public statement in 1947 and 1948 anticipating Israel and then saying we look forward to working with Israel, but there wasn't a public discussion about this. Privately, of course, different people had different feelings about this. Max Weinreich encouraged Uriel, for example, to study in Israel, to do work in Israel, but he always had a bit of resentment toward the Israelis, many of whom, of course, were people he knew from Eastern Europe. He went to university with these people. The same thing with the YIVO Yad Vashem project. They knew these people intimately. But when, for example, YIVO would invite representatives of the Israeli government, remember, YIVO was then on Fifth Avenue and 86th Street near the Israeli consulate. So they'd invite representatives to come to the conferences, and the young representative, who was a Sabra, would speak in English. And Weinreich would get very angry. You have to speak in a Jewish language, Hebrew or Yiddish. Privately, he wasn't so happy with a lot of Israeli politics, but YIVO was generally supportive of the creation of a Jewish state, but they wanted a place for Yiddish in this Jewish state.
Thank you for what was, in fact, a very moving talk. I remember, I have 2 footnotes to what you said.
We should introduce yourself, first of all. I'm
Sam Norwich. I was director of YIVO from 1980 to 1992. I'm Anita's brother. I had to give my yichus. I came across a memo that Weinreich wrote to the Verwaltung of YIVO in early 1944, in which he apologized for the low productivity, the low publication rate of YIVO during the previous year, blaming it, of course, on what you call the exigencies of the war. YIVO had only published something like 4,000 pages during 1943 in the various fields of its research. And I remember thinking I would give my left arm for 1/10 of that kind of productivity. The second remark is about the building on 123rd Street. The way I heard the story, the building was basically donated to YIVO in 1942 as Wiedergutmachung, as reparations on the part of, it was donated by the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which owned the building, Louis Finkelstein, so that YIVO would have a larger place than the one it occupied in the Hayas building on Lafayette Street. I heard that story from Ruth Messenger, whose mother was the assistant to Finkelstein. In those years, a woman of Ruth's mother's capability would not have been a professor at the seminary, or as is today the case, the head of its rabbinic program. A woman would only be a secretary. But Finkelstein and Ruth Messenger's mother together did a crucial thing for YIVO. With the sale of that building in '55, YIVO was able to purchase, together with some additional donations, the building we occupied from 1955 until 1994.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, the building sold for about $400,000, and they raised an additional $80,000. And then they had to refurbish the entire place.
I heard they paid $1 for the building, the first building.
The first building,
Yeah, they had to pay, the symbolic $1.
right.
Invite you up to start the next panel going. So, yes.